The very last verse of the Gospel of John reads like this: "There are also many other things that Jesus did. If every one of them were written down, I suppose that the world itself could not contain the books that would be written." I'd like us just to think about that for a moment. What a wonderful way to end the story of Jesus. There were also many other things that Jesus did. If every one of them were written down, I suppose that the world itself could not contain the books that would be written. Which is the author's way of saying, this isn't everything. This book doesn't contain everything that Jesus said or did. It's important for us as 21st century people, particularly in our culture, to remember that in Jesus' day, writing was a laborious process, and it was an exacting process. You couldn't just hit backspace back then, could you? Couldn't just hit delete or save as draft for another time. It was a laborious process to write something for an audience. And so every word counted. Every word a writer in the ancient world would have considered very carefully. And so at the end of the Gospel of John, we are told, this isn't everything. There is even more that I could tell you about Jesus. So the author does say at the end, there are also many other things that Jesus did, and that's no doubt true. But the author could have said, there are also many other things that Jesus said, and that also is no doubt true. For all of the material we do have in the Gospels from Jesus, no doubt there were countless other conversations with countless other people that are not contained within the Gospels. As I was thinking about this sermon, it occurred to me, and of course I've thought about it before, it is tantalizing to try to imagine how many other conversations Jesus would have had with so many other people, and if we only had access to that additional material. But we have what we have, thank God, in the 4 canonical Gospels. So today's Gospel lesson contains the longest recorded conversation of Jesus in the entire New Testament. Just let that fact wash over you. Of all the other conversations that we have of Jesus in the 4 Gospels, none of them are as lengthy as this one conversation with the Samaritan woman. Fred Craddock observes about the passage, at first, the conversation seems to hold little promise, the two being distanced by race, gender, and religion. It's a strong observation. In the culture of the time, in the world in which Jesus and this woman lived, at first the conversation seems to hold no promise, the two being distanced by race, gender, and religion. So it's still a little bit early today. We're an hour ahead of where we would have been last week. Let's have a little audience participation at this point. If you're so inclined, finish this sentence with me. The more things change, the more they stay the same. Right? Think about our time, how we continue to struggle with our divisions based on race and gender and religion. It was true in Jesus' day, and we continue to struggle with these barriers that tend to divide us. So this conversation between Jesus and the Samaritan woman by the mores of the day should never have happened. A Jewish rabbi should never have been in conversation with an unaccompanied Samaritan woman. It wasn't done in that day and time. But Jesus had conversation with her, and she was willing to engage in conversation with him. At first, it would have held no promise based on the cultural mores of the time. But they kept talking. And as it turns out, we're here 2,000 years later, remembering, honoring this conversation between Jesus and this anonymous woman from Samaria. The longest sustained conversation of Jesus's that we have is his conversation with the woman at the well. It is oftentimes said in our day and time that we are losing the art of conversation. I happen to be one of the people saying it. We are, in this culture, losing the art of conversation. We're losing the ability to talk with one another in a productive way, in a respectful way. This is clearly true in our public discourse. A couple of years ago, it was sometime before this pandemic, when Debbie and I were in England for the last time. At that time, Winston Churchill's grandson was still a member of Parliament. He was in the process of retiring, but he was still a member of Parliament, Churchill's grandson. And we happened to be in the country when he was interviewed about his retirement. And he said, as a part of that interview, the dialogue in Parliament is getting coarser. And that's exactly the word he used, coarser. Winston Churchill's grandson, talking about the UK Parliament. So, of course, we came home in a few days, and we were back home within weeks of hearing that interview in England. And here, stateside, a member of our Congress was retiring. And he was being interviewed, and he said, the dialogue in Congress is getting coarser. The exact same word used across an ocean to describe the devolution of the art of conversation. We are in danger of losing the art of conversation. At a public level, yes, but also at a more personal level. Think about this with me for a moment, if you will. We have more tools at our disposal for conversation than ever before. No generation has had the means of communication that our generation has. And yet, for all these increased means of communication, in so many instances, meaningful relationship building conversation is getting harder and harder to come by. Think about how often somebody may say, can I just text you, or can I just shoot you a quick email? Sometimes, of course, that means of communication is valid. Of course, I use them too. But sometimes we need to talk to each other. Sometimes we need to hear nuance. Sometimes we need to be in the same space and see each other as we enter into meaningful dialogue with one another. I read several years ago that there are 3 essential components to meaningful conversation. The first essential component is we have to acknowledge our differences. When we talk to someone else, we're talking to someone who sees the world at least a little bit differently than we do. So for meaningful conversation to happen, we have to acknowledge the differences between us. The second essential component for meaningful conversation, however, is recognizing what we share in common. Surely, most human beings can agree that what we share in common outweighs what divides us. Most of us could reach that conclusion if we're conscious of it. And in the article, the third essential component for conversation is openness to learning something. Open-mindedness. A willingness to be impacted by what we hear. So the three essential components of meaningful conversation are acknowledging difference, recognizing commonality, and being open to change as a result of the conversation. I read another book a number of years ago, and the author made the point, in any meaningful conversation, you may be 99.9% convinced of your position, but there needs to be at least 0.1% of you that's willing to change based on the conversation. You may be 99.9% convinced of your own conviction, but at least 0.1% of us needs to be willing to change, to hear something new and act on it. It's a part of essential conversation. We are in danger of losing the art of dialogue, of the art of listening. So important for us all to remember how important listening is in conversation. My favorite English priest and spiritual writer said on many occasions that when people are talking at each other or past each other, but not with each other, all that's happening is that there's a disturbance of the air. Such a memorable observation. When people just talk at each other or past each other, not with each other, there's just a disturbance of the air because nothing's being heard. And if nothing's being heard, then there's no relationship being cultivated. Fred Craddock is right in his observation of this conversation between Jesus and the Samaritan woman. At first, the conversation seems to hold no promise, the two being distanced by race, gender, and religion. The Samaritan woman herself says in John 4:9, "How is it that you, a Jew, ask a drink of me, a woman of Samaria?" And then John adds in parentheses, "Jews do not share things in common with Samaritans." John's telling us this conversation was countercultural. And yet look at what came from it. Here we are 2,000 years later, still reflecting, still able to draw lessons from this one conversation between Jesus and this woman of Samaria. At one level, the conversation held no promise. But at another level, we remember that Jesus was constantly recognizing and breaking down barriers between people, between men and women, between the rich and the poor, between the righteous and sinners, between Jews and Gentiles, and yes, between Jews and Samaritans. Jesus was constantly breaking down barriers that people had raised to keep distance between them. Jesus sought to bridge the gap, to bring people together. We saw an example just last week in chapter 3 of John, Nicodemus. Nicodemus came to Jesus by night, John tells us. it was such a countercultural conversation. And here we have the ultimate countercultural conversation in historical context. A Jewish rabbi speaking with an unaccompanied woman of Samaria. There was no more politically incorrect conversation than that. And yet, look at what happened when Jesus and this woman actually engaged each other in meaningful conversation. I'll close with this. We're blessed right now to have a Sunday school class being offered on Christian art and images of Christ. There are countless works of art that have been derived from Jesus and the woman at the well. Countless works of art have tried to capture the essence of this moment. Also, there are countless words that have been offered over the years in reflection on this passage. There are whole books written on chapter 4 of John's Gospel. In preparing for this sermon, I pulled one of my books on John 4 off the shelf. It's 693 pages on this one story. 693 pages of reflection based on this one conversation between Jesus and the woman at the well. Sometimes it's important to focus on the granular detail of a passage, but sometimes it's good to step back from the trees to see the forest. Sometimes we're studying something, it's important to zoom in and look at that something as closely as possible, but sometimes it's good to zoom out and put whatever we're studying in context. I suggest we zoom out this morning and look at what's really happening here. This conversation between Jesus and the woman at the well reminds us of the crucial importance of human beings being able to talk to one another, to listen to each other, and to listen to other points of view, being open to learning and even open to change. We can study this passage in granular detail, but we can also see, as we zoom out, the essence of what's happening here. Jesus shows us, and this Samaritan woman shows us, how to have meaningful, mutual dialogue. On this third Sunday in Lent, at this moment in our cultural history, as people of faith, let's all please remember the importance of recognizing and cultivating and preserving the art of conversation. Amen.